Okay, good afternoon, everyone, once again, and welcome to Chamber Music America's webinar today about grant programs and grant writing, and that there is an art to it, and we do have someone who is very expert with us, Director of Grant Programs, José Feliciano, who I am glad to introduce. So please place your name and your instrument or your organization in the chat. And then later on, we're going to be this is going to be recorded right now. Please put your questions in the chat, and then after the recording is off, that's when we'll be addressing the questions that are in the chat. So, okay, once again, welcome, and I'm pleased to introduce Jose.
Hi everyone, José Feliciano here with Chamber Music America, Director of Grant Programs. Thank you for the introduction, Susan and Julia. I've been at CMA for the past 3 years in July, and before that worked as a grants administrator and grants manager for a local arts agency, and we'll talk more about what a local arts agency is as part of our discussion a little bit later. But I did that for about 4 years and managed things at a regional level, and then managed things at the state level for the state of Connecticut for an agency that I worked for after that. So in total, I have over a decade, I realized as I was doing the count today, of grant writing and grants administration under my belt. So I'm happy to be able to do this presentation and also answer your questions later on. So if you're here for the Get the Funding Best Practices for Grant Writing, you're definitely in the right place. So the agenda in terms of what we're going to cover, we're going to look at the grant landscape as a whole, key terms, the anatomy of a grant, and then best practices for applying to grants. Again, submit questions via chat until the end. For today's conversation, some tips for crafting good questions and conversation. Speak from the eye. Don't disclose confidential information as you're asking your questions or insider knowledge to your organization. Try to phrase questions in a general way that helps more learners, and that's all of us here on the Zoom call today. And then remember that everyone is a learner, but might be at a different stage of knowing. So helping us to not make assumptions of sort of what the group knows or doesn't know. So the grants landscape. What is a grant? Is sometimes a question that we get. So a grant is a form of financial assistance, and it can really be provided by government entities, foundations, or corporations. And we have this example from our webpage of grants and awards, right? Those funding opportunities and awards for small ensembles and presenters. In Chamber Music America's case, for other organizations, right, those can be much broader in scope. So a little more about government entities, because those are sort of unique, and they're actually one of the primary places that folks will go for grants. Government entities can include federal, regional, state, and local funders. Examples include the National Endowments for the Arts, which receives congressional allocations, also known as the NEA. State art agencies, so SAAs, they receive legislative appropriations from their respective states, their jurisdictions, the federal government. So you can see a little bit of this trickle-down effect happening. Then local arts agencies, which use local, state, and federal resources. And then municipal arts funds like creative districts, mayoral funds, etc. Collectively, the NEA, the SAAs, the LAAs represent a network of public funding agencies that are entrusted with distributing grant funding and providing services to artists and cultural organizations nationwide. And one interesting point is that there are around 5,000 government entities which give out funding throughout the United States. But when you compare that to the areas of the US that are considered independent municipalities, there's around 91,000 municipalities versus the 5,000 government entities that fund those. So you can see some of the differences and balances and scale there. In terms of different types of grants, they're usually categorized in terms of private grants versus public grants. And a lot of folks ask, what's the difference? So private is really thinking about foundations, corporations, associations, intermediaries like Chamber Music America, right? They tend to have shorter guidelines for their overall grant applications, brief proposals with fewer attachments. They're sometimes less transparent about their processes. It depends on the individual organization. They tend to be less stable in terms of multi-year funding for either individual artists or organizations or ensembles. Right, which means that the grants might change year over year in terms of what they're looking for, in terms of changes to the guidelines, things of that nature. Um, and generally, because these are from sort of more local agencies, there tends to be a lower success rate. But there's sort of a foil to that in that the private foundations tend to support and provide, in some cases, more services. And we'll talk a little bit about what those services can look like later. Public means federal, regional, state, or municipal grants. So those government entities generally, those tend to be much longer guidelines, right? Lengthy proposals with neater attachments. Sometimes you're looking at 10 or more attachments that are associated with an application. It's a transparent review process because it has to be fully transparent to the public. It tends to be more stable in terms of the funding, and that this is multi-year funding that is supported by a particular government administration or by a particular set of laws in some cases. And it tends to have a higher success rate in terms of receiving awards from those grants once you've gotten past a certain step in the process. So some key terms. Oftentimes when you're looking at applications, there's a lot of jargon that lives in the grants administration world, in the grant writing world. PC, PD, PI, or PL are all the same thing. What they really mean is the lead person, right? So your principal or primary contact, your project director, your principal investigator, your project leader, they're the person who is in charge of having communication with the organization who's the funder. Oftentimes, they're going to be that person who is the lead on the project and understands the project sort of inside and out. You must have one to receive funds from organizations that are funders. And sometimes you can be required to have a co-PC, right? A co-primary contact. And again, those are the folks with substantial knowledge or leadership with the project. And sometimes, and this is the case with some of CMA's grants, they have to be tied to a particular location that is a function of the grant requirements. So, for example, our grants that are New York City based, the primary contact has to be based in New York City. LOI, RFP, and CFP are some terms that you'll also hear thrown around. A letter of intent, an LOI, is a request for proposal, an RFP, or a call for proposal, a CFP. An RFP and CFP are used interchangeably a lot of times. And what those documents are, they're just an initial document that shows or signals an organization's interest in submitting a formal application to a funder. CMA, for example, doesn't have LOIs, but often you'll see LOIs, those letters of intent, especially at the government level. So this is your municipalities, your cities, your regional arts funders, which will be requiring that sort of paperwork. The LOI is usually really short, 1 or 2 pages, and it's showing an understanding of the funder from you as the organization, and it's showing that you understand the project that you're proposing well enough to talk about it in a really succinct way. It's typically a bridge between the interests that you have in providing some sort of submission or application, and it helps both parties, right? The funder as well as the applicant create some alignment early on in the process of applying for a grant. So the money is sometimes confusing to folks, especially the terms around budgeting and things of that nature. So direct costs and indirect costs tend to be the most confusing for individuals as they're drawing up their budgets. Direct costs really easily and quickly. There are things that are able to be dollars that are able to be allocated towards your project. So they can include salary, supplies, travel, artist payments, cartage, venue payments, streaming costs. It really depends on the guidelines, but there's a lot of different areas that it can cover. Indirect costs tend to not be able to be allocated to your project. There's still real costs, but they're not part of the grant, so to speak. So they're what's commonly seen as overhead, or sometimes, especially in government grants, they call it F&A, so facilities and administrative costs. So that's literally things like the rent for your space, right, or the janitorial services that are cleaning the bathrooms after a performance event, for example, would be considered indirect costs for a project. Cost share, cost match, the match, all similar terms, all different ways of saying the same thing. This is a portion of that an applicant contributes to pay for the project. It can be in cash or in kind, depending on the grant. In kind are those things that have a cost value to them, a cash value to them, but are commonly volunteered. And volunteer time counts as part of that, and then it shows as a percentage or a ratio. So sometimes you'll see it as a 1-to-1 match or a 50% match, something of that sort. Some grants do not have a matching requirement, but they still require applicants to explain how they will cover expenses that are not covered by the grant. So CMA is an example of this. We don't require matching for our grants, but we do require applicants to explain how are the rest of the expenses being covered. If, say, a grant is giving out $10,000, but the project costs $20,000, where is the rest of that money coming from? So the anatomy of a grant, what are they even asking for? Right? That is a question that we often get via phone calls, via emails. Right? Folks are asking, what do we need? What do we want as a funder? So grant narratives are really about answering the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how of your project. Attachments are usually connected to the funder's own needs for reporting or adding to your narrative. So an example is if you're attaching um, a timeline, for example, which is really common for a lot of grants, not just CMAs, that's explaining the when. And it's an easy way to explain the when a project is happening without having to necessarily type it all out, especially since people plan in different ways. And it allows us as the funders to pull that information out really easily from the application and see it as at a glance. Um, the other piece about the funder's own needs, for example, CMA gets grants from other entities, and then we distribute some of those funds out to our applicants' eventual grantees. Right, we have our own reporting that we have to do. So some of that information that is requested by a funder is really to ensure that they're able to do their own reporting. And sometimes that reporting is also to their funders, their members, the folks who are supplying them with the capital, with the revenue to be able to redistribute. So the typical key parts of a grant proposal are the LOI, depending on the grant, the abstract or general information about a grant, the narrative, the budget or budget narrative, any attachment, and then what's commonly called certifications or assurances. Sometimes that's just a checklist at the end where you're checking off, yes, you read the grant proposal. Yes, you read the guidelines. Yes, you filled out all of the particular areas. In a lot of cases, that work is done for folks a lot of the time through the fact that the process for applying for the grants has the required fields versus the non-required fields, and that makes it easier for a lot of grants. The key parts of a narrative are really thinking about the need and significance. So, what is the problem? Why does it matter? The goals and objectives. What do you want to achieve? The target population. So, who will you be serving, and where will you be serving those individuals, those audiences? Activities and methodology are all about the what and the when. So what will you do? When will you do it? Oftentimes, this is the sort of easier part for folks, right? It's basically the ins and outs of timelining a project, right? What's happening? When is it happening? And then the impact and evaluation, right? How will you measure that success over time? What does that look like for your organization? For the ensembles that you work with, for the audiences that you work with. Sometimes it's for the volunteers that you're working with, depending on the grant. The question we often get, why do questions feel repetitive? Many grants have multiple readers or multiple rounds. So, especially the government grants tend to have multiple readers and multiple rounds. So, different people might see different parts of the narrative. It can be several days or weeks before readers or reviewers revisit a second part of a narrative. Sometimes one group of readers reads one part of a narrative and then another group of readers reads another part of a narrative, and they need that preliminary information because that information doesn't exchange hands between groups for what's scored on one side versus what's scored on another side. Sort of the organization that's the funder aggregates all of that together and comes to a conclusion or to a score to select a grantee. So the good part that folks have been waiting for, what are the best practices for applying to the grants? So there's 10 major best practices for applying to grants. Understanding the funder's mission, starting early, reading all the guidelines, being clear and concise, having strong work samples matters, telling a compelling story, creating a realistic budget, reviewing and revising, building relationships, and tracking and learning. And we'll talk about these extra parts overall as we go through the next couple slides. And also, I'll have a resource that I'll throw into the chat when we're done with this part of the presentation, which actually has all of these listed on it, as well as what each of the areas means in a little more detail about each. So some of you might be thinking, I know all that. I want the secrets. So these are sort of the secrets, the hints and tips. So secret number 0, the not so secret secret. Read the full guidelines and become familiar with the funder. Right. So look through the website, look through the guidelines, look through the materials that the funder provides. For a lot of funders, they're going to provide a lot more information than it feels that you might need as an applicant, but you definitely want to make sure that you're reviewing all of those different pieces. There's going to be information, for example, on, say, how to submit a timeline in a format that makes it easier for the reviewers to look at. Or there might be information, for example, in CMA's case, we have sample budgets and sample answers. So sometimes folks are asking questions about what's the answer that you're looking for, or how can we phrase this a little bit better? And for an organization like CMA, we actually have some samples with suggested language or that help you see a sample of something that can help you reconstruct your own paragraphs, your own narratives to make things a little bit easier. So reading all the guidelines helps you understand where you might get stuck, where you need more information, or where you need to call the funder for help, because asking for help is very real. So the numbered secrets, number one, don't write to the grants. So find grants that fit what you already do. It's sort of a big no-no in the grant writing world to write to the grant. And what that means is find grants that fit the most important pieces of your organization and what your organization is already doing. So you want to make sure that that scope in terms of, right, your region, your capacity for your organization to achieve the results, etc., fit the grant that you're applying for. When I was a regional funder, we only served a segment of Connecticut, which is where I'm from. And oftentimes we would have folks that were from out of area try to apply towards for our grants. And they're like, but we're only one town over. And it's like, yes, and you're also outside of the funding region. It is literally illegal for us to fund someone from outside of that area. Right. So it doesn't make the applicant look good or the organization look good when they're sort of trying to sneak into a grant, and that's sort of the most most obvious example of not writing to the grant and finding something that fits what you already do. And then you can reach right towards a grant, but make sure that it's an achievable, attainable reach. So an example of this is applying for a project that is a little bit beyond some of the scope of what your organization is working on, but you know that your organization is working towards that particular aspect in your strategic plan already. Right, or in the planning that you're doing as a presenter. So you're going to have to think a little more about that particular grant. Um,
Yes.
but in
No,
thinking about
of course
that
I can't
particular
see it.
grant,
Yeah, but
you'll
this is
be
one of
able
the big
to
heavier ones. I
come
thought there
to
might be a
your
plastic one.
own conclusions
Okay.
on what that looks
So
like.
this is the only thing that I see. I
Uh,
didn't really see anything connected to the
And
base
it
now.
sounds like there's someone unmuted, so if we
Yeah,
could mute.
made everything so organized. Yeah. You put everything away so you can. Everything is organized. Or something.
Okay, number two. Be clear about why the grant matters. So make sure that the need is relevant to the requirements of the funder. The funder is going to be really clear about what a grant is for. So for example, with CMA, some grants are for chamber music, for small ensembles in general, those small ensembles being 2 to 10 musicians. Some are going to be more geared towards classical contemporary. Others are going to be geared more towards jazz ensembles. Right, you want to make sure that you are in the right category. And did I just unshare? I think I did. Let me reshare from here. There we go. Right, use local data or data that's unique to your org. So as you are thinking about your plan, what you're writing that narrative to, right? You want to make sure that that information is relevant to you. Sometimes folks get caught up with talking about like the history of their location or the history of their organization or their ensemble. If the guidelines didn't ask for that specifically, you probably don't need it. Or there might be another place where that's required. So look at what the guidelines are for that. And then answering the why really means answering why now, why here, why this group of people, right? So why is it important to you as an organization, as a presenter, as an ensemble, whatever that might be the case. Be clear about the goals versus the objectives versus the activities. So a project has one goal. This is the purpose for your project, and it can be aspirational, right? This is what you're hoping for the grant to do. if you get the funding. The objectives, those are the parts that make the goal happen. They're measurable and attainable. I always like following the rule of three for this. Have sort of three major objectives that you're working towards. And then an objective leads to activities. So the activities are the things that are being measured that make up the objectives. So for example, the objectives might be that one objective might be that you're reaching an audience of 1,000 members. The activities that you're going to have for that, right, are going to be that social media marketing that's going to happen. It's going to be working with the social media or marketing manager on having that timeline for when those particular posts are going out on social media. So those are the activities that are connected to this objective of reaching 1,000 members, that are connected to this project goal of having this performance for your particular location. Number 4, have specific, measurable, and clear points. So be specific about project activities. Don't assume that the readers know what you do, right, and know what you know. Assume that the readers are unfamiliar to a degree with what you're working on, what you're doing, and you want to explain that well enough to give that point across. But obviously, don't take up all of the space that you have to write to the narrative or write for what you're trying to achieve. And again, that who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then you also want to make sure that you are preparing the proposal so it can be read easily. Some reviewers are skimmers, some reviewers are deep readers, and that's purposeful. Right? Reviewers are people, is the first thing, right? And being that they're people, that means that they're going to have different styles of approaching the information. For the funder, it's really important for them to have a mix because the skimmers are going to be able to see, right, sort of the big broad brushstrokes. They're the ones that are going to latch on to things like the vision of your proposal and why it's so important to your community and make that argument for why that's a really good application. The deep readers are going to be the ones who are looking at things like, well, this thing in the timeline, it doesn't quite fit, it doesn't quite vibe. This part of the budget isn't realistic. They would have to reconsider that in order for this project to get off the ground. This isn't fair pricing for paying the artists or paying the musicians, right? Those sorts of catches are going to be deep reader catches. And overall, right, those sorts of insights from the readers and the reviewers are what end up creating the feedback that is used to pick out who are the applicants who are going to receive the grant. Short paragraphs, topic sentences help to lock in the details. And if a grant is asking for more detail somewhere, make sure to add it in. Oftentimes, you'll see this in budget sections. They'll say, if there's anything that you want to add to the budget or make clear, here's a section to write in a little more. Is not a suggestion, write in a little more. Basically, that's a place that those deep readers, right, and the skimmers are going to be looking for more information if they get confused. And if that information's not there, right, it just made a budget score lower for that particular funder, for that particular group of reviewers. And then proofread, don't be afraid to ask for questions. So have someone who's unfamiliar with your project and with you read your proposal. Take advantage of sample resources, budgets, info sessions provided by the funder. All of you are here. Some of you, as I mentioned, are repeat names and faces from prior workshops that have been held by CMA, as well as prior application workshops. So those are all positives, right? Those are those taking advantage of the resources, taking advantage of the sessions to learn more. And then a lot of organizations, right, will have office hours or will have ways to get in touch with the organization. Definitely don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out. But also be aware, right, that sometimes you are one of 200 applicants for just one grant. And if an organization is hosting multiple grants, over the course of, say, a season. For example, CMA has 4 grants that are live right now on our roster. Right, there's a lot of applicants, and that's a lot of questions. So make sure that your questions are focused. Make sure that you're reading those guidelines. So when you ask those questions, the funders, like us here at CMA, we can answer those questions and be really concise and also really direct, because we want to be as helpful as possible as grants administrators, right, as folks who are helping applicants. And along with being as helpful as we can be, we also want to make sure that we're not answering questions that the information sort of already there. If we're answering clarifying questions, that's always really helpful for us, because it allows us to do a deeper dive with a particular applicant, and really get at what they're stuck on. So a little bit of an aside, we have, as I mentioned, 4 programs that are active right now, but 6 programs total that we'll be working on throughout the year. Artistic projects is New York City only, right? The who's it's for, New York City based ensembles and what it funds, right? Rehearsals, performances, recording commissions, community engagements. Classical commissioning, which is refreshed for this year and is targeted for ensembles and presenters, right, is specifically for US based composers, Western classical contemporary tradition. The Empowerment, Impact, and Growth grants are upcoming, and those will be for our jazz ensembles. Live currently, we have our Ensemble Forward grants, which again are NYC only and are for New York-based classical contemporary ensembles and are for mentorship and career support in the form of giving funding for consultants to work with organizations and ensembles to bring them to their next level. New Jazz Works, which is upcoming, again for jazz composers, and then Presenter Consortium for Jazz, which is for presenters to work on joint jazz touring performances and projects. So you can see, even with CMA as an example, there's sort of multiple areas that funders will frequently have for applicants to look at, to examine, and to see what fits that organization, that applicant the best. Right? Is it something like an artistic projects, which is broader based but more focused geographically? Is it something that's classically oriented, like classical commissioning? Is it something that's for larger works and new works like New Jazz Works? There's different ways of looking at just the whole roster of what an organization has to offer, and making sure to read through an organization's guidelines, making sure to review what's on the website is really helpful to help you focus your questions. And also, it helps you get ahead of the calendar for yourself. A lot of applications will take a lot of time to fill out in terms of just the initial planning. And once you're rolling with the narrative portion and you've planned that project, things go quickly. But those internal conversations that need to happen, right? Those searches for something like a consultant to help you out with a project, can't happen the day of, and is difficult for the funders to answer questions the day of or the week of, when there's so many other applications that are being reviewed, so many other applicants that are coming in. So being mindful of that is sort of the last part to think of overall, is making sure that you're always looking and thinking about what those timelines look like, and ideally making sort of a timeline calendar for yourself of what funders are creating what grant opportunities. And if you miss one for 1 year, making sure that you've noted when that grant period is so you can look it up for the following year. So that's it for me today. Thank you for everyone. I want to give time for the questions that folks have, and allow a little less of the talking head moment of me behind the screen here, sort of just going through the slides. But our contact information is in this presentation, and this presentation will be part of the back end of the resources for you to look at once everything is over and uploaded to the cloud and to your membership on the back end. So you'll be able to see all of these emails, and all of this information is also on the website in terms of our contact info as well. So you can always look at the information where the team's information is located and look up each of our emails, and reach out to us about our individual programs.